My very dear friends, suffice it for me at the very outset to say how happy I am to be amidst you this afternoon or this evening. The time is short and I have a lot of ground to cover. So, without much ado, let me straight away go to the heart of the matter. We are during this interaction discussing journalism for citizens in the social media age. Now, whether we are in the social media age or in any other age, the purpose, or as the French like to call it, the raison d'être of journalism is basically to give unbiased, unprejudiced facts to the readers. Earlier, in the 20th century, this was difficult enough an objective as it was. Now it has become even more difficult simply because we have so much opportunity for fakery, misinformation, disinformation, and whatever else you may think of. The social media per se has both its advantages and disadvantages. As you're all aware, on the upside, it gives opportunity to a lot of people to express their opinions, which might otherwise have got suppressed. And that itself, I think, is a very good thing. It makes media realize, it makes them get an almost instant feedback about their content and the stories they're writing, etc. But it also has a very sharp negative side. Namely, it allows people to shoot and scoot, get away with expressing opinions, of engaging in conduct without any sense of responsibility. As traditional journalists, this is something which we cannot think of. There cannot be any power without any responsibility. And I think that is an important idea which we must keep at the back of our minds all the time. So one problem these days is the competition which social media provides all other media, traditional media, whether it's television, radio, print, whatever you may think of. On the other hand, we are also facing in the 21st century a problem which is very peculiar, namely that we are both furthering and recipients of various narratives. And that can be very difficult into a person who is trying to practice journalism honestly. He has to compete against people who engage in all kinds of sensationalism. And as I said, they are in a position to exercise power without responsibility, whereas the people gathered in this room don't believe in this dictum at all. So, this is one set of problems which we face. Another two have got more traditional roots. One is the rate of technological change in society. Correct? It is now exponential. If somebody like me, if my grandfather were to visit this planet, it would be unrecognizable for him. I remember him when he was still alive in the year 1964. That's when he passed away. And if he were to visit the earth again, he would not be able to recognize it as the same place. So rapid has been the change. And as we go along, I do propose to delve into the history of change. Suffice it for me only to say that at the moment, this change has become exponential. Now, our challenge, whether we are journalists or citizens or practicing professionals in any field, is that how do we deal with this change? Every technological change is just not a technological change. It has many other dimensions. It affects our social systems, our beliefs, our values, our let's say, basic sense of what is right and what is wrong. Okay? Now, it was bad enough coping with this change during the 19th and 20th century. But now it has become a major problem. It's become another dimension of a problem which we all have to confront with in our day-to-day lives. And journalists are absolutely no exception. So let me talk something about this change and how it has affected us and how we can deal with it to the extent possible. You see, if you go back to the 19th century, the rate in change, the number of inventions which came during that century were comparatively few. So if I were to ask you, what can you think of which was really disruptive? Which technology was truly disruptive in the 19th century? Any guesses? Anybody would like to take would like to suggest something? Telegram, Morse code. Even otherwise, there was railways, correct? That brought about a huge change in our lives. But the changes were such that society could cope with it. Mostly they were positive. When it came to railways, for example, it enabled free movement, easier movement. People could travel from one place to another. That broadened their perspectives, correct? And it brought people closer together to each other. You come to the 20th century and you will find the number of changes are not something which you can count on your fingertips. The rate of change had become much faster. So you had, let's say, in the field of communication, you had radio and television, correct? In transport, you had automobiles, aeroplanes, later in the century, wide-bodied jets. Now, mind you, each of them has been disruptive in its own right. It has taken, what has happens, it's opened up people's outlooks. As far as journalists are concerned, they can start reporting. They could start reporting from foreign countries at a much faster pace. Correct? And that whetted the appetite of the citizen for international news, of which he was otherwise getting starved. You come later into the century, or even earlier, let's say you had telephone, electricity. Each of them had a profound effect on our life, on our beliefs, on our thinking, as people moved towards more cosmopolitan societies. They moved from rural areas to urban areas. They also became developed, but all this also, they lost the closeness of family ties. And this meant basically that when they moved from close-knit communities in rural areas, in villages, to towns and cities, urban spaces, they felt more alienated. Now, I don't know how many journalists were sensitive to this and brought out stories of this kind of, alienation which people were experiencing. See, we must not forget one thing. Journalism, in one respect, people who write stories, columns, reports, are in one sense the writers of first drafts of history. So it's very important that the first draft should contain an account of events as they occurred, without bias, with ignoring the reporter's own likes and dislikes. Now, I think a lot of people realize this. There was a lot of realization. That's how I presume that's how all these principles evolved. But somewhere along the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century particularly, World War II onwards, somebody realized that human minds could easily be manipulated. You could, if you repeat a lie 1,000 times, people begin to believe that it's the truth. So we were flooded with propaganda. Now, as a citizen, I'll tell you something which would be of interest to everybody in this room. Way back in the early 1950s, my father was posted to the United States of America. We went there as a family, and we used to watch television together. We used to read the Washington, even when I was 8 years old, the family used to get the Washington Post and I would read it. Whatever I could understand, I would take, and the rest I would ignore. Now, mind you, when we were there, we were flooded with news items, stories, articles on how horrible the Soviet Union was. What a vicious country, all evil and nothing else. And we believed it. We were all very vulnerable, we were young, we were impressionable. Even those who were not impressionable, like my parents, they also believed it. 3 years later, we came to India and we got a shock. People in India didn't share this perspective at all. In fact, you had a communist government running in Kerala, and people were quite comfortable with it. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister at that time, and the government was functioning. Now, that is the kind of thing which should make us think that how much conditioning are we being subjected to. And it started at that time. So ideologies were born in the 19th century, whether it was communism or socialism, but they hardened in the 20th century. Hardened so much that polarization started. And today, whether we talk about India or the US or Europe, we are all living in highly polarized societies. I guess the question to be asked is, not just journalists, but even as citizens, how do we cope with this polarization? And what are the solutions? Unlike you, I am not a professional journalist. I do write columns, that's true. I started as a journalist but became a civil servant somewhere in 1970. And after retirement, I again took to writing columns. So on the basis of the feedback which I have received and my own experience, I can only suggest to you that whether we are living in this age of the social media, there are certain things, principles, which still remain sacrosanct. There must be a difference, for example, between what is reported what is said in the editorial page of a paper and the stories which it reports on other pages. Likewise, on television, when a report is put up, it should be factual. Nothing should be suppressed, nothing should be exaggerated. Because remember, this is the first draft of history. But look to how journalism is being practiced all over the world. We all know what is happening in Bangladesh. The kind of oppression, the horror stories which are coming out, houses being burnt. But the Western media, I'm told, is totally oblivious of it, refuses to take cognizance. The White House is also not taking cognizance. Why? Because it does not fit into a certain narrative which these people want to promote. Now, the question is this really good journalism? If you ask me, the answer would obviously be no. Now, I must tell you about a book which I read recently. It's Lakshmi Murdeshwar Puri's Swallowing the Sun. It's a wonderful novel. It spans about 20 years. It's a story of uh, failed romance, failed marriages, successful marriages. It oscillates between princely India and British India. But one of the lead characters in that book asks a very interesting question, which I'm going to raise in front of you today. This was during British times, just when the British Raj ended. She asks, why should we see everything through British lens? I think that's an important question to ask. Why should we apply Western standards to judge, or why should we look for Western solutions to problems which are peculiarly Indian? Now, before I close, let me give you an example from something which I dealt with for many years in my career as a civil servant, which is the problem of corruption. Way back in 1996, I was Additional Secretary to the Central Vigilance Commission. A question of corruption came up again and again. So, as someone who was dealing with the subject as a professional administrator, and both as a person who felt that, our country deserved better, I felt that as a citizen. I went through a lot of literature, a lot of theory, and surprisingly, I found some very revealing findings about corruption. You see, the concepts which have been developed in the West to deal with corruption don't necessarily work in African countries. When you transplant those concepts there, those practices there, they take on a totally different hue. For example, even when we talk about democracy, correct? When you go outside the West, they almost become, despite voting and everything, they are very often, these regimes are synonymous with personal rule. Now the thing is, every country is at a different stage of development. The grammar of politics is different. The historical trajectory is different. So why should values which have been, or institutions which have evolved elsewhere, or which suit a particular country, why should they be imposed in another country? Let that country find its own solutions. So that is what I feel about India also. Even as far as journalism is concerned, I don't think we should always be taking our cues from the West, because the cues which you get may be suitable for those cultures, those societies, and sometimes they are outrightly hypocritical and wrong. I gave you the example of Bangladesh. They are not practicing the very principles they preach. Otherwise, why should all those horror stories from Bangladesh be blanked out? They're taking place in full view. Indian media is reporting it quite freely, but it's not figuring anywhere in the West. And the White House is also not taking cognizance of it. So it's wrong, I feel, to always think that what is West is best. So may I end my little interaction with you with the way I started, that look, reports in newspapers are often the first draft of history. They need to be unbiased, they need to be fair, the facts need to be verified and then reported. We should not bring our likes and dislikes into what we do. I think that applies to a number of other professions, including as administrators. This is an important dictum. We are being conditioned all the time by narratives, but consciously we should not be seen to be promoting a narrative, ignoring facts which are inconvenient, or exaggerating certain facts which do not really deserve to be exaggerated. The final arbiter, of course, is the person himself who is doing the reporting, and he has to see ultimately that what he reports should square up with his conscience. So thank you all very much. I'm very grateful to you for giving me this opportunity to be with you. Thank you.